Hello, welcome to the Black Celts podcast Q&A. Here I will ask Ibrahim Ali, author of the Black Celts, different questions that have been sent in. Assalamu alaikum Ibrahim. Can you explain your take on the recently discovered 13th century burials in England being multicultural?
Hello, welcome to the Black Celts podcast Q&A. I've had quite a few questions come in, and one that comes up very often is a response to an article called Biological Evidence for Black Women in the 14th Century London. An interesting article by Dr. Rebecca Redfern and Dr. Joseph Hefner, human osteology curator and assistant professor of anthropology at Michigan State University. Interesting. The article reads, "How much do we know about the people who lived in medieval London?" Human osteology curator Rebecca Redfern explains what skeletal remains from a burial site in East Smithfield can tell us about population diversity in the Middle Ages. Whoa, big headline. But if you read the Black Celts, you would see that virtually, 1300 years before then, during the Roman period, and also before then, during the Iron Age period, we already have abundance of skeletal evidence and analysis from the time of Mourant that concluded that the remains found in Wales, the remains found in the area of Winchester, those found in the northeast, the so-called chariot burials, all those had so much in common. And what did Mourant say they had in common? They had in common that the closest coefficient of racial likeness was with the Guanches of Canaries, the Egyptian Coptics, people of Pompeii. So again, the finger pointed to Africa, Northwest. It pointed to the Nile Valley, Mediterranean region, etc. And that was the basic population of the British Isles. And then in the Black Celts, I talk about the strontium isotope analysis, which again, strontium isotope analysis helps you kind of trace if people came from warmer climes, because obviously the strontium, like calcium, etc., these are embedded into the bones based on your diet, etc. So you can actually trace if somebody was brought up on the Nile, or if they were brought up in Northwest Africa, or if they were brought up in the Danube or the Balkans, etc. So it's quite a great technique to show ancient migration patterns. And if we looked at the evidence I put in the Black Celts, well, that was for the Iron Age and the Roman period. You're talking about 2,000, 2,500 years ago. It's kind of interesting period. So the Iron Age period had the closest relationship with Northwest Africa and the Nile Valley and the Italian area, Pompeii, etc., Etruscans, some quite interesting populations. And then when we look at the strontium isotope analysis, we find a huge constant migration patterns, between warm climates such as in North Africa and Britain in general. Now, that was the Iron Age plus the Roman Age. Those were sites which were really kind of very, very prominent sites, So it doesn't matter if it's Winchester, doesn't matter if it was basically the southwest of Wales, doesn't matter if it was the northeast region, and those burials, they all had something in common. They all had something very much in common. The closest relatives they could find were in North Africa and in Northeast Africa, basically the Nile Valley, etc. And so it lends evidence to the so-called Hamito-Semitic, Afro-Asiatic. I mean, these are not appropriate names, really. They're very colonial names. But those language groups have remnants and have left remnants and traces behind in Irish and Welsh and Scots. And as we find that even, over 150 years ago, 200 years ago, 400 years ago, with the translation of the Bible from Hebrew into Welsh, suddenly people realized that there was a huge connection between the so-called Semitic languages and Welsh and Irish. And again, if you compare Phoenician, Canaanite, with Gaelic, Irish Gaelic, the connections are just too spooky. They're like sentence after sentence. I mean, Valency talks about that, and a whole range of people talk about that. So, in terms of this article, what can we learn about it? Well, we can learn that scientists at prestigious universities don't really do a lot of research into what went before them. Have any of them picked up the research articles by Mourant, for example, and what he found? Have any of them looked at the strontium isotope analysis, throughout the British Isles, showing the definite connections with warmer climes in Africa? And then this article talking about health inequalities is incredibly misleading. Because if you think about it, you cannot apply today's health inequalities for people who are a supposed ethnic minority in the United Kingdom to 1,000 years ago. These people were not immigrants. These were Britons, and they were Britons. They weren't immigrants. They were part and parcel of the population. And they're making the presumption that because you have certain skeletal bone shapes, or but then when you look at the identity in terms of genetics, we have R1b for the males in Africa and in Western Europe. How do you separate those from each other? So in a sense, you have genetic populations, but we even know that genetic population that makes up the British Isles essentially has an awful lot in common with the R1B1 DNA in West Africa. So when we look at this article, this person, the Black Death pandemic of 1347, and making the presumption that because of inequalities, Black women were, had a higher mortality rate, etc., etc., etc. And then they talk about the work of Professor Geraldine Heng, who studied racism in the medieval period, and her work shows that people of African origin or descent who worked in Europe as diplomats or have been enslaved in Europe, as well as those who have been freed or born free, suffer from social, economic, political forms of discrimination. But the problem is this: it's like 2,000 years ago. If you look at the different various tribes, whether it be Silurs, whether it be the Kanti, whether it be even the Belgi, I mean, you had clear links with skeletal groups who've been analyzed by Mourant in Africa. So whether it be Guanches, whether it be from the Nile, whether it be from Pompeii or Etruscans, etc. So in a sense, the indigenous inhabitants themselves were people of color, various colors. They were not one particular shade because you had a melting pot of people. So, it says using this method, we studied 41 individuals, 19 of whom were female. For our total sample, 30% of the population was not of white descent. Focusing on the female evidence, 4 females were likely to have been mixed heritage, 3 were of African descent. What do they base that on? This one has a wide forehead. Yes, it's got to be, let's say Somali. Wide forehead, yes. I mean, really? You serious? This one has a retreating forehead, and we're gonna say that's gonna be, yeah. Let's label that one as, a suburba from the Riffian Mountains, etc., etc. This one's got a narrow skull. This one's got a broad skull. The definitions are useless. Definitions are stupid. They really, really are. Because in a sense, if you look at the populations, they were thoroughly mixed together, and you couldn't say this is white or this is not white. You couldn't say that. You can't tell from the bones what color somebody was. You cannot tell, and you can't tell their heritage just from like, oh, that skeleton's got a long head, it's got a broad head, it's got long arms, it's got short arms. You can't do that. You cannot actually do that. What Mourant was doing, he took a series of different ancient burials from across in his collections from across the world, right? Not across the world. It was basically Mediterranean, but thank God he included some African collections. Some scientists will not even include an African collection. They will simply just take a bunch of European collections and compare them to each other. He actually went ahead and said, well, I got a collection from the Canary Islands. I've got a collection from Egypt. I've got a collection from the Etruscans. I got a collection of this. That's how you should be comparing these different burials. Not making presumptions as to, this is a white collection, this is a brown collection, this is a black collection. Those things are really amateurish, and they're not even scientific. They're not scientific at all. So when you read this article, it's really not scientific. It really, really isn't. It is institutional sort of racism in a sense, because they're making the presumption that the African female is going to be on the bottom of the pecking order in any society, even the ancient world, when that was not true at all. Um, Most of the wives from the Belgi in that collection of skulls definitely were from a different phenotype group. And one person presumes it's African, another person presumes it's Laplander, Sami, Northern, because the Mongolian, Asiatic type of, and that's their words, not mine. So they put all sorts of like conclusions, but they don't do the DNA, and then you don't find a follow up. You will not find a follow up of these articles with detailed DNA analysis. Have you noticed that all these collections of hidden away and on display, you don't really have this detailed analysis of skeleton by skeleton by skeleton of the DNA. And the DNA is preserved, because then you can say, because you know what would happen. You'd say, okay, that was a male E1B1. Hey, he came from Egypt, or you'd have R1B1 V88. You say, well, that's very close to the Hausa, So it is selective, This is not. You should do. If they're true scientists, you have random analysis. You take 20 of these, and then you do DNA analysis. You shouldn't know which one was which. That's how they should do it. That's how you should. If you're a true scientist, that's how you should do it. You take 10, 100 skeletons. You do your DNA analysis on them. You should have them coded so that you don't know who's who, and you just do the test. So you don't know if that one was from Winchester, whether it's from Egypt, whether it's from whatever. Do your tests, match them up, have a look what you got, and then you can say, well, actually, this is a blind test. We did the test on them, and you found that these groups are related to each other, and then you can then find out what countries they came from. And then you can actually say, wow, how come this group is related to this group? Was there a migration? Was there, connections, trade, previous settlements?
Please subscribe and like. And stay tuned for more new research. Please subscribe and like. And stay tuned for more new research.